Hi guys, and welcome to another Sunday session. Today's topic of the week is approaches from paper 2, as voted for yourselves on the Instagram story. Make sure that once you've watched this video you like, subscribe to the channel, and also kind of drop some messages on Instagram as to what you want to see over the next couple of weeks in the run up to exams for year 13 and to Dep 5 for year 12. So this is quite a good topic to do at this point because it's something that applies to both year groups. And as you can see from all of the information jam-packed on the board, it is quite a large topic. So I'm just going to stick to kind of the basic AO1 points, particularly for approaches looking at the assumptions, some of the named researchers or studies that you need to know. And as always, just a little bit of an overview. If following this video you think there's a particular approach you would like me to go into more depth about, or if you think you benefit from a comparison of approaches video, then let me know and I'll get one filmed in the next couple of weeks. So I'm just going to kind of go from kind of top to bottom, kind of all the way around. Kind of starting with some of the approaches in actual chronological order, so from the work of Wilhelm Wundt with the origins of psychology, what are kind of the starting point, and how relevant did each of these approaches become. So if we're thinking chronologically, we actually need to start with the psychodynamic approach and the work of Freud, because that was very early in the 1900s. So as you can see, you've got quite a large little section at the top there on Freud. So obviously in the psychodynamic approach, the only named researcher is Freud, so you do need to make sure that you know who he is, and that you are using his name effectively in a written response. Now, the main assumption of the psychodynamic approach is that all of our behaviour is governed by our unconscious mind, and unconscious drives that we have, or that it stems from childhood trauma. So in terms of talking about the role of the unconscious mind and the psyche, one of the things that you could use to help you explain this is the iceberg analogy. So this is the idea that kind of the tip of the iceberg that's bobbling along above the water, that represents our conscious mind, which is things that you can physically kind of experience in your conscious awareness. So your current thoughts that you're having, that's what's going on in your conscious mind. You can access it and you can change it. Just below the surface of the water, you've got the pre-conscious. Now, the pre-conscious is things that we are aware of, but not necessarily in control of. So things like our dreams, or what we sometimes call a Freudian slip, where we accidentally say something and we don't really know why. Freud would suggest that that's kind of our unconscious mind revealing itself, and kind of creeping up into the subconscious. And then obviously you can see the majority of the iceberg is represented underneath the water, and that's referring to the unconscious mind, so the part of our mind that we can't access, and we also have no control over. So typically where a lot of our repressed trauma, or kind of deepest, darkest desires would be. Now, once we've understood the kind of role of the psyche in the mind, there's a few of the key bits of AO1 that are listed on the spec that you will need to be familiar with. So some of those include defense mechanisms. So within the role of the psyche, if you get asked about the role of the unconscious mind, that's referring to its job. So what does it do? What's its purpose? And the role of the unconscious mind is to protect us from any distress or anxiety, often by using defense mechanisms employed in the unconscious part of our mind, so we don't even realise we're necessarily using them, in order to protect us from trauma. So on the specification, there's actually 3 defense mechanisms that are named, that being denial, repression, and displacement. So denial being the refusal to accept something, repression about pushing down those unconscious, those kind of traumatic or negative thoughts to our unconscious mind. So we're putting it in a place we can't access it. And then displacement is about you taking out your feeling, typically something like anger, and placing it on a powerless substitute object. So that could be, for example, going home from work and kicking a chair because you've had a really bad day, in the office, or you've had an argument with somebody and then you come home and take it out on a loved one. So that could be on a person or a thing. There are some additional defence mechanisms that are not named on the spec, but that you could use in an answer. So things like projection and also regression. Alongside defence mechanisms, you've got the role of kind of the tripartite structure of personality. So this is looking at the 3 parts of our psyche, and that's a little bit of an exam hint that if you are talking about the personality, you do need to refer to it either as a tripartite or at least say a 3-part structure. Often when this has come up in the past as an AO1 question, it's normally a 4 marker, and that 4th or final mark is for referring to it as a 3-part structure. So that's a very essential thing to remember. So within that, you've got your id, your ego, your superego. What you need to know about each of the 3 parts of the psyche is you need to know what is their function. So what principle do they operate on? Is it morality? Is it reality? Or is it kind of pleasure? So for example, the id is the pleasure principle. It's the selfish part of our psyche that's developed first. It's about kind of pleasure at all costs. The ego is obviously managing that unconscious conflict, so that's our reality principle. And the superego is our morality. That's the part of our personality that wants us to always do really good things and be the best version of ourselves. So you would need to make sure that you know what principle they operate on, what year were they developed. So are they developed from birth to 18 months, from kind of 3 to 6 years plus? And what would happen if there was an imbalance of power. So for example, you might get a scenario-based question suggesting if one of the parts of the personality were more dominant rather than the ego, how could that affect your behaviour? So if the id was in charge, how would that affect you negatively, and vice versa with the superego. You've also got then the psychosexual stages of development. So that's oral, anal, phallic, latency and genital. And you need to make sure that you know them again in order. You need to know what happens or what occurs at each unconscious conflict. And also what would happen if you became fixated in that. So if the unconscious conflict wasn't resolved during those ages of development, how would that affect you? So things such as if we don't resolve things during the phallic stage of psychosexual development, that's where things like the Oedipus and the Electra complex could come into play. And I've also put the example of the case study of Little Hands on there as well, because you can use it either as extra AO1 when you're explaining the psychosexual stages, or you can bring it in as kind of a case study as evidence to support the role of the unconscious and the role that kind of dream and psychoanalysis has to play in therapy. So that's the psychodynamic approach. Kind of moving on then chronologically, we've next got the work of Pavlov and Skinner in the behaviourist approach. So unlike the psychodynamic, which is kind of psychic deterministic, the behaviourist approach is environmental deterministic. This suggests that all of our behaviour is predetermined by our environment and that it's all about learning through experience. So it's a very scientific approach in terms of that it's purely focused on experimental methods, observable and measurable behaviour, whereas the psychodynamic approach is unfalsifiable. So if you think about your features of science. So within behaviourism, you've got classical and operant conditioning. So classical, learning through association, and you can either use the classic Pavlov study, Pavlov and his dogs, that is named on the spec, so you do need to be familiar with that study because you could get asked a direct question about Pavlov. You could also bring in Watson and Rayner. So whilst Watson and Rayner isn't listed as a key study on the spec, it is pretty much apparent on every single mark scheme. And you already have to know Watson and Rayner and the Little Albert study from phobias, from the psychopathology topic, which I did last week. So if you can utilise that study for more than one topic, you might as well chuck it in there. It's a good way to show the practical applications of behaviourism to other topics, like phobias. And then you've got operant conditioning, which is about learning through reinforcement. So knowing that positive reinforcement is about rewards, negative reinforcement is obviously about the removal of a negative stimuli. And then you would use Skinner's study with his rats to help showcase that. And the main thing is to not muddle positive and negative reinforcement, and to also explain that negative reinforcement is different from punishment. Punishment is used as a deterrent when we don't want behaviour to be repeated, but reinforcement is all about wanting somebody to repeat the behaviour. So remember, positive is being rewarded, negative is taking something away, but in order to get you to carry on that behaviour. So a good example to use is if I've got a headache, I might take a paracetamol, that takes away my headache. The next time I then have a headache, I might be more inclined to repeat that behaviour of taking a medication to make sure that my headache goes away. Okay, so it's a good kind of example to use to help you showcase what we mean by the removal of negative stimuli. Now, I'll come back to social learning theory because I'm trying to go through this kind of in terms of the order that the approaches actually appear. However, just a reminder that behaviourism and social learning theory are both types of learning approach. So whilst they fall under that same umbrella term, they are actually two separate approaches that were done at different times. So if you get a question that is worded as behaviourism, you would only include information about Pavlov, Skinner, classical and operant conditioning. Whereas if you got a question that said social learning theory, you would particularly talk about Bandura, vicarious reinforcement, and everything I'm going to recap in a second. So just that reminder that they are separate. The only time you would include both approaches in the same answer is if the question was more broad and it just said learning approach or learning approaches. If that was the case, then either would be relevant, but really kind of when you're decoding and rumbling the question, look out for that because that can possibly trip some students up. So following on from behaviourism, kind of next chronologically, at roughly around similar times, we've got the cognitive approach and the humanistic. So to start with the cognitive, this one's a little bit trickier because it's very theoretical. There's a lot of kind of theories and experiments, but it isn't very physically observable. A lot of the ideas within cognitive are theoretically based, so it's a little bit trickier to get your head round, but once you've kind of cracked the acronym that I'm going to share with you, then hopefully you should remember the key features. So cognitive approach is all about the idea that thoughts influence behaviour, but more specifically conscious thoughts. So if you think about comparison of approaches, a nice thing to kind of bear in mind is that the psychodynamic approach believes that thoughts influence behaviour, but they specifically think that it's unconscious thoughts, whereas cognitive believes that our current conscious thoughts that we are aware of, that is what governs and controls behaviour. So for example, if we have faulty thoughts or negative or irrational thinking, that will lead us to behaving negatively and irrationally. That's why when we do topics in psychopathology like depression, we use the cognitive explanation, because this belief that thoughts directly impact our behaviour and play a role is quite relevant. So within the cognitive approach, we've got this acronym of SLINKY with a C, to kind of help you remember the different components of the AO1 and kind of the different things that you could include if you got, for example, an essay on the cognitive approach. So you've got the role of schemas. This is probably one of the biggest components of cognitive, and definitely one of the easier ones to explain and to elaborate on. So within the role of schema, this is the idea that that is a building block of knowledge that kind of grows and adapts with age and experience. So we constantly are adding to our schema throughout life as we learn new things. The main thing you need to know about a schema, other than being able to define it, is to give an example and talk about how a schema could be useful, but alternatively how a schema might not be useful. So for example, the things that make it useful to us is that it allows us to become less overwhelmed by new environmental stimuli, by filling in the blanks and kind of supporting that experience. However, alternatively, it can sometimes lead to things such as prejudice, by kind of allowing us to develop preconceived ideas, so that when we're faced with a similar person or scenario, we make a snap judgment. That obviously can have negative implications for us socially as humans. and also things such as impacting eyewitness testimony. Say memory, year 13s, we've done it, year 12s, we're on the memory topic currently, so we'll be coming up to this just after Easter. But when we talk about eyewitness testimony, we say that sometimes when people forget things, when they're giving an eyewitness statement, the use of schemas might allow them to fill in the blanks, and that could then lead to false memories and ultimately false eyewitness testimony. So schemas can sometimes be unhelpful. The L in Slinky stands for lab experiments, to just remind us that even though it is more theoretical and not in some cases observable and measurable, there are empirical ways we can test these theories, so it is still a very scientific approach. The first I is for internal mental process, so that's just referring to things such as memory, perception and attention, so anything that's going on internally in terms of our cognition. The N stands for neuroscience, so cognitive neuroscience is about the mapping of our physical brain with cognitive functions, so looking at things such as the Broca's area in the brain, which I recapped the other week in my biopsychology video, and thinking about how that part of the brain is maybe active during a speaking and listening task because it's linked to speech. So they'd use things such as case studies of brain damaged patients or brain scanning techniques like fMRIs or EEGs to identify how the physical brain and our cognitions are kind of intertwined. So cognitive neuroscience now is its own discipline, and is probably, if it was its own separate approach, would be the most up-to-date and modern one, because it combines some of the best parts of cognitive with biological and makes this very, very empirical methodology. The last part of Slinky, you've got computer and theoretical models and inferences. So computer and theoretical models are things such as the multi-store model of memory. In fact, the multi-store model of memory is a really good example to use if you get a question about theoretical models, because it is a visual or diagrammatic representation of the steps and stages involved in an internal mental process. You know, there isn't actually boxes in our head called short-term, sensory register, long-term, but that is a diagram of how we think our memory might possibly work. And that's what allows us to make inferences, so to go beyond that immediate evidence, to make assumptions about these processes. So kind of those two parts are intertwined. And often in terms of computer models, our mind does get likened to that of a computer. That's one of the assumptions of this approach. And that's because we input information from the environment, much like a computer, we process it using coding, and then we have an output, and the output is our behaviour and the thoughts that we have. Next, I'll talk about humanistic, here because it's next on the board, and B, kind of it comes next in terms of the timeline. So this was roughly around similar time to cognitive, kind of late 50s, early 60s. And the main two researchers' names for this one is Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow. So this is very much kind of the odd one out of the approaches, in that it's very much focused on this idea of holism and free will. So a lot of these other approaches are reductionist and they're deterministic. And whilst that has some benefits, as we know from issues and debates and from when we kind of evaluate these, ultimately that can be something negative, but humanistic is basically the complete opposite. They don't believe that the scientific method is appropriate for studying human behaviour, and instead will opt for much more ideographic methods, studying individuals and small groups of people and trying to explain their unique experiences, rather than these very large sample experiments using more nomothetic approaches like the biological or cognitive approach. So within humanism, besides concepts like free will and holism that you would talk about, some of the key points of AO1, this is probably one of the chunkier AO1s, I would say, for approaches, as in there's loads of key terminology. However, the concepts are very kind of logical and straightforward, so it's quite a nice question to come up. So you've got things such as the role of the perceived and ideal self. So the perceived self being how you view yourself and how you think you are, and the ideal self obviously being what you want or what you're striving to be. Which ties into this kind of concept of congruence and incongruence. So congruence, as you can see by the little Venn diagram here, is about how close your perceived and ideal self are to each other. So what we're aiming for to have good self-esteem and kind of ultimate sense of wellness is we want what we think we are and how we want to be as similar or aligned as possible. A good word to use when describing this is consistent. So it's the consistency between the selves. And the more consistent they are, we are said to be congruent. The further the gap between the selves, the more incongruent we are. Now, one thing that can help us achieve congruence or kind of minimize that gap between the versions of the self is what we call unconditional positive regard. Now, this is basically unconditional love no matter what. And this can come from lots of places. It can come from family, it can come from friends, but it can also come from therapists. So a kind of humanistic technique for supporting and improving our mental health and well-being is client-centered therapy. And Rogers came up with this idea that client-centered therapy is very much a therapy technique that's based on talking therapy, in which you develop like a therapeutic alliance or a kind of a rapport with your patient. And what the client does is, in working with the therapist, they try to improve that level of congruence by providing them with that unconditional love and support, giving them a safe environment in which to try and create a more positive version of the ideals of the perceived self and a more realistic version of the ideal. So that hopefully by being more positive but also more realistic, we can kind of try and come to a happy medium. However, some people experience what we call roles of conditions of worth. So if you don't feel you are receiving that unconditional positive regard, you might start to believe there is a condition on your worth. Now, that could be real in terms of it could come from people like parents or teachers or significant others saying, you know, I will only be proud of you if, I will only be happy if. So kind of giving you almost like a bit of an ultimatum or judging your behaviour, or it could just be perceived. So it might just be something that you think because of your previous experiences. So an example I always like to use is, let's imagine you've got a sibling who got really good grades in school. You might think your parents will only be proud of you if you achieve those same grades. Or if your sibling did something which disappointed your parents, you might think, I can't do the same thing because I won't get love and support in return. Now, all of this is kind of also gearing towards this idea about self-actualization and us wanting to be the best possible version of ourselves at all times, which is obviously impossible to do. But Maslow came up with this hierarchy of needs. So he kind of used this particularly actually in a business setting. So this is very much occupational psychology. And a lot of you studying business or media and other subjects might already be familiar with this. And this is the idea that we can improve people's happiness and productivity in the workplace if we help them reach self-actualization. So we help them reach their goals and this ultimate sense of well-being, then that's going to be beneficial for everyone. So it came up with this kind of hierarchy system. So starting from the bottom, you've got your basic needs, what we call physiological needs. And that's literally things like food, water, shelter, the basics that we need to sustain life and to kind of physically kind of keep ourselves going. Above that, you've got safety needs. So that is in terms of security, living in an area where there are laws and things in place to keep you safe. So that's, again, quite a physical basic need. You've then got more kind of emotional needs, so things such as love and belonging, self-esteem needs, and then eventually, if we work our way up this system, we should be able to reach a sense of self-actualization. However, this isn't permanent, so things can change in our life that mean we might reach self-actualization, but then very quickly we could be dropped down. And so a good example to use for that one is things such as if you're in an abusive relationship, you might feel that you no longer have the element of safety, and without safety you can't achieve love and belonging. That's going to impact your self-esteem. So it's really important that in order to reach the top needs, your bottom basic needs are met, and that can fluctuate based on your life experiences and things that happen to you as an individual. Then kind of coming into more modern day, we've got social learning theory and the biological approach. So social learning theory in the corner here is kind of the other type of learning approach that I mentioned. And within this, you've just got a few key concepts. So this also agrees with behaviourism, that behaviour is based on the environment. So it's very much that nurture perspective rather than nature, and that we learn through experience. But instead they think that the experience is focused on observation and imitation. They're kind of your two key buzzwords you would need to use when talking about SLT rather than behaviourism. So by observation and imitation, we obviously need watching and copying, but not just anyone. This is about the observation and imitation of role models. So these are people in your life that have significance, that are similar to you, or that might have a higher status. So either loved ones, friends, peers, teachers, maybe celebrities, for example. It's all about somebody you look up to. And that you have things in common with, and that makes you more likely to imitate their behaviour. Now, the main things that make you more likely to imitate their behaviour, besides identifying with them, is that vicarious reinforcement. So this is if your role model is rewarded for the behaviour they're displaying, you see that reward, you want that reward, and therefore you copy their behaviour in order to get the same thing as them. Now, this is not to be muddled with positive reinforcement. Positive reinforcement is about you getting a direct reward, like a primary reinforcer, whereas vicarious reinforcement is more of a secondary reinforcer. You are feeling rewarded by seeing the possible reward you could get. So the main thing is you're kind of think about living vicariously through someone else by seeing them get something and thinking, yeah, I want that as well. So I'm going to copy it in the hope I do receive a reward. You're not directly being rewarded yourself. Now, one of the things that affects whether or not we actually do observe and imitate role models' behaviour is what we call mediational processes. And these are factors that kind of slide to kind of tie in a little bit with the cognitive approach, because these are things that affect our internal mental processes and allow us to decide whether or not we think we're actually going to copy the behaviour. And there's 4 parts to this, and we give it the nickname of ARM or ARAM, depending on what kind of order you learnt it in. But this stands for attention, retention, reproduction and motivation. Again, I know this is something kind of cross-curricular that links with PE. So obviously we need to pay attention to the behaviour, we need to retain it, so remember what we've seen, we need to have the physical skills and ability to reproduce it, and then we need to be motivated, often through vicarious reinforcement, to want to do the behaviour. And if we meet that criteria, then we choose to model directly the behaviour that we've seen. And the kind of key researcher named on the spec for this one is Bandura. So you do need to be familiar with Bandura and the Bobo doll study, because this is about how aggressive behaviour in particular is learned. And also for year 13, you need to know Bandura's Bobo doll study for the aggression topic, because SLT is one of the social psychological explanations of aggression. So kind of revising that study in depth has kind of 2 benefits across 2 different topics. So again, similar to knowing like Watson and Rayner, these key studies that you can use multiple times are essential when it comes to knowing your spec. And then finally, really quickly, we've got biological approach. I kind of recapped over this in a bit more depth when I did the biopsych video, so please check it out. But just a reminder of what you could be asked within the biological approach. So there's no named researchers or studies for this one. There's a few suggested ones that I'd recommend. However, similar to kind of cognitive or to humanism, there isn't necessarily an actual study you need to know. Just lots of, again, key terminology. So starting off in the biological booklet, you've got this idea about behaviour being down to something physical within the body, so looking at how our brain influences behaviour and our biological structures and processes, like the role of neurochemistry. So we start off the booklet looking at the role of genetics, so the difference between a genotype and a phenotype, the role of twin and adoption studies, so MZ and DZ twins, and kind of using concordance rates to explain behaviour. You've got the role of evolution, so natural and sexual selection, and hopefully, particularly for year 13, you can see as we've done a lot more topics, these ideas and concepts have been revisited constantly in other topics. So things such as synaptic transmission on genetics, we've looked at that in the role of aggression when talking about genetic and neural explanations. We've looked at some of these concepts when we've done biopsychology and looked at the different parts of the brain, and things like the nervous system, the fight or flight, sympathomedullary pathway. We've looked at genetics and synaptic transmission in schizophrenia. We touch upon it in things like OCD and psychopathology. So these are concepts that actually, by revising, you're not only preparing yourself for an approaches question, but you're also solidifying that kind of core topic knowledge that you need to be successful on other areas of the specification. So I would always kind of not necessarily prioritise biological approach, but definitely spend a little bit extra revising it, because it has major benefits for your other paper 1 and paper 3 topics. So for example, evolution, natural and sexual selection, we've just done that on relationships with booklet 1. So again, it's just a reminder of how important it is. The biological structures within the biological approach, unlike on the biopsych topic, you won't be asked directly about the brain or types of neurons. That is more in the biopsych section. However, you do need to be familiar with synaptic transmission and the nervous system. So the nervous system being the main biological structure you would be asked about in approaches. So the difference between the peripheral and the nervous and central nervous system, again, sympathetic, parasympathetic branch. So just knowing the different sections and how they link to behaviour is the essential part. So things such as where do reflexes come from? You might get a lot of scenario-based questions about fight or flight. So just familiarising yourself with that terminology, with diagram style questions as well, particularly for synaptic transmission. Just a reminder, like I mentioned in the last revision video, that you can use diagrams and drawing to help you explain or kind of visualize the structure and process of synaptic transmission. So don't be afraid to get your pens out and have a little colour code and a draw. It's a good way to show clearly to the examiner that you understand that process, and also if you're running out of time, it's a quick way to get yourself a couple of marks. So I would always make sure that you've got that diagram and labelling as part of your response. So that was a bit of obviously kind of 30-minute whistle-stop tour of the approaches topic, but hopefully that just gives you a little bit of an insight into some of the main key terminologies, researchers, and the overall assumptions for each approach.